Libya's parliament is set to name a new prime minister to head the transitional government this week. However, the plan has raised concerns about the possibility of a new power struggle. Two candidates, a former interior minister and a sitting minister, are canvassing support for the position.
The Speaker says a vote to name one of them as Prime Minister will take place on Thursday. This will follow consultations with the High Council of State, an advisory body based in the capital, Tripoli. The Parliament's move to appoint a new government is a setback to the UN mission in the country. The UN has been advocating for a presidential vote, initially scheduled for December 24 last year. But the poll was postponed following disputes over laws governing the elections and presidential candidates. The move also increases concerns that Thursday's vote could see a repeat of a 2014 schism that saw two parallel governments emerge, leading the country to slide into armed conflict. The UN says negotiations are ongoing with Libyan parties to try to avoid a return to the sort of discord and disarray that has marked the past decade. The UN-backed government in Tripoli says it will remain in power until real elections take place. But some legislators have argued that its mandate ended in December of 2021.
To speak a little bit more about this, we're joined by Libyan correspondent at The Guardian, Chris Stephens. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us. So, as we mentioned, the Parliament will name a new Prime Minister. Will it allay concerns over the possibility of a new power struggle, as we mentioned in the introduction?
I think, yeah, exactly as your report says. I think there's going to be now a power struggle. The government at the moment is a unity government, which was formed to get Libya two elections in December, and it replaced two rival governments, one in Tripoli and one in Tobruk. Now, the problem is those elections never happened. They were abandoned, and there's no sign of them happening. So now the Parliament in the East is saying, well, in that case, we'll have a new Prime Minister. But the existing Prime Minister in Tripoli is saying he's not going to go. So on Thursday, if they produce this new Prime Minister, then there'll be two rival Prime Ministers, and it will be a big problem for the United Nations. Which Prime Minister do you recognise? Or do you recognise both of them, or none of them? And then does the country then split?
So the two candidates who are vying for the position, as we mentioned, the former Interior Minister and the Minister Councillor, they have presented their plans and submitted bids to replace Dbeibah. What exactly are they proposing, and how do they foresee themselves overcoming this impasse if Dbeibah refuses to go?
Well, yes, their plans are quite sort of politically a bit vague. I mean, they talk about bringing the people together and so on. But I think it's understood that the front runner is a former Interior Minister, Fatih Bashaga. It's understood that he would be more favourable to factions in eastern Libya, as opposed to the current Prime Minister, Abdul Dbeibah, who's more favourable to factions in western Libya. So it's more of a power struggle than a policy struggle. And it also comes down to, when are these elections going to happen? Now, the current Prime Minister says he wants elections soon. That's why he was put in the job. But Bashaga, the guy who's likely to replace him, he says, no, we can have a nice long wait before we need to have the elections.
So just looking forward to what's expected to happen. So the vote to name the Prime Minister, as we mentioned, takes place on Thursday, but it follows consultations with the High Council of State. What clout does this advisory body have? Well, the High Council of State was Libya's had a whole series of transitional governments, and they've had basically a decade of chaos and civil war. And the High Council of State was formed as a sort of second administrative body to the Parliament. Now, the thing about the High Council is it doesn't have any power. It can advise, but it can't really block anything. So in some ways, it sort of doesn't matter what the High Council says, as long as it's consulted. But I think what you're seeing is Parliament basically really wants the outside world to accept its new Prime Minister. So it's saying, look, we're going through all the motions. And you see, we've consulted with the High Council. We're going to ask for their opinion before we make a decision, because they want to say that, we are the ones who make the decision, and they want the outside world to agree to change the Prime Minister.
So we mentioned the possibility that the move also increases concerns that Thursday's vote could see a repeat of the 2014 fissures that saw two parallel governments emerge, leading the country to slide into armed conflict. So how possible is that we could see what we saw, those two rival administrations in the East and the West, because of this? And of course, each was supported by militias and foreign governments.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's now very likely, because I think on Thursday, unless they cancel this vote, they will vote for this guy, Bashaga, and then the country will split. There will be, again, one government in the East, one in the West, and presumably then the civil war will restart, because the civil war never stopped. They just stopped fighting. They declared a ceasefire more than a year ago. And it was one of the great UN achievements that the ceasefire has held. But it's only held because everybody was waiting for some sort of decision. Well, if the idea of elections of this decision is now abandoned and it goes back to two rival powers, then there's a very real chance that the war starts again.
As you mentioned, the UN itself, the move by the Parliament to appoint a new government could be a setback for them, because they have been advocating for first holding a presidential vote. We know that has been rescheduled from December 24 last year. Is it going to push for more negotiations? And the postponement itself was due to disputes over laws governing the elections and presidential candidates. I mean, would this move create any headway? I very much doubt it.
Yeah, I think it's a real crisis, because, as you say, the UN, it bets everything. This peace process has taken 2 years to get ready, and the big event was the election. And before the election, the UN said to all the sides, all the armies, look, let's all wait and see who the Libyan people elect. And the Libyans, they all registered to vote. They have a very high number of people are registered. Now the elections have been abandoned for all sorts of procedural reasons, and there's no sign of them starting. The UN doesn't know what to do. I mean, on the one hand, it's saying, come on, let's hold these elections anyway. On the other hand, it's thinking, well, do we start a new peace process? But then it's thinking, but, if we do that, we just go back to where we were 2 years ago, where we had two armies fighting each other.
So going back to the current Prime Minister, Debeba, he, as you mentioned earlier on, has repeatedly said that he and his government will remain in power until real elections take place. How does he foresee that happening, especially as legislators has argued that his mandate ended last year? And I'd imagine, according to whatever legal framework, constitutionally, if there's any adherence to that, that would hold water. But he has also accused the Parliament Speaker, who's led the efforts to have him replaced, of fueling the divisions in the country, and is now urging that the drafting of a new constitution occurs before any elections.
Yes, in fact, while you've been on the air, Debeba has actually been giving a live televised speech in which he's repeated some of these points. I mean, the first thing he said is, I'm not leaving. I don't care what Parliament does. But the second thing is he's saying, look, I was put in as a temporary guy until there were elections, and so we need to hold these elections. We couldn't hold them in December because there were all sorts of procedure issues, but we should get those issues out of the way and then hold the elections, soon. Now, Parliament is saying no. We don't want to have elections. We want to have a brand new peace process, and they're talking about a minimum of 14 months, which leaves Parliament in power, and basically it kills off the peace process. But the problem comes is that Parliament were the ones who chose Debeba, and he accepted it because they chose him, and the UN accepted it because the UN asked him to choose a new united guy, and that's who they chose. So Parliament will argue, if we can choose one, we can certainly choose the next one. And there's where the sort of constitutional snarl comes, really, because Debeba will say, well, no, you can't replace me. I'm supposed to be here until the election. And they say, well, there is no election. We can replace you.
Now, the Parliament Speaker has also said that lawmakers have adopted a roadmap to hold the presidential elections within 14 months after agreeing on constitutional amendments. Whatever happens on Thursday, how possible would that be if, you say, the country could be split in two? And Khaled Al-Mashri, who's the head of the Advisory Council, has also said the members have agreed with Parliament to adopt a defined roadmap of elections. How could that happen if the armed groups themselves, particularly in the west of Libya, have announced their objection to the changing of government and are now calling for local and international parties to help agree on a roadmap?
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of Libyans are saying. A lot of Libyans on all sides are very cynical, and they think a lot of people are saying that the parliament basically just does not want elections because they think that they won't win those elections, because a lot of the existing politicians are very unpopular on all sides. And so a lot of Libyans think, well, actually, nobody really wants an election because they'll lose, or they fear they might lose. So they look at this new roadmap as kind of spurious, because after all, Salah was the guy who signed the election law in September. So, he made the election law, he made the roadmap, he made all the legislation to hold the December elections. Now, he didn't cancel the elections. The elections were cancelled by the officials like 3 days beforehand because there was so much chaos. But if Salah's now saying, well, wait, I don't want to hold these elections, I want to have actually a brand new law, you sort of say, well, why? What was wrong with the last one? I mean, the one that you signed, that you created. So again, 14 months is thrown out there, but I think a lot of Libyans think, nobody wants the election, and maybe not just Parliament. I mean, maybe nobody on any leadership.
Well, thank you so much for speaking to us. Certainly, it sounds like a complicated set of events. Speaking to us, there is Libyan correspondent at The Guardian, Chris Stephen.